The subject of the presentation, and I assume you can all hear me, is no space, no time, no mind, and it's about the Zen and science converging. I'd like to say that most of the presentations that I hear on this in your group are very personal. Obviously, there is a backstory to this journey that I've been on, but I'm not going to be talking about it too much. It's going to be mostly about the subject. And so the no mind doctrine is kind of the theme about that I'm going to go through here. There is no Bodhi tree mind, no star, no stand body of mirror bright, since all is void, where can the dust alight? And this sutra is kind of the theme of this presentation. We'll start with no space. Creations are numberless. I vow to be one with them. Well, how numberless are they? Well, let's talk about the visible universe to start with. There are approximately 200 to 700 plus billion stars per galaxy. Our Milky Way galaxy has about 200 billion. It's about average, actually. There are about 100 to 170 plus billion galaxies in the universe. That totals approximately 20 to 1,190 billion trillion stars. This is the visible universe. It's beyond our imagination. Now, the total universe is that visible universe that I just described, but that's only 4%. We can only see 4% of the universe. The other 96% is dark matter and dark energy. And if we think that they're constant, they are not. Even Einstein thought the universe was static, and he made a mistake until he came up with his equation of E equals mc squared, and he showed that energy and matter are interchangeable. So the percentages are changing constantly. So Einstein decided to come up with a newer way of looking at Newton's theory of gravity. And without getting into Newton's theory of gravity, we all know it was an equation that showed the bodies that have mass attract each other. Even human bodies attract each other, anything with mass. Well, he looked at it differently. What he decided was that matter was actually governed by curved space. In other words, he visualized that space itself is curved, and that the sun is in the center here, and our Earth is the purple, and our moon the red, and they form dimples in a curved space environment. And the only thing that keeps them from falling into the curve and collapsing is their centrifugal force. So he started to think of space as being curved, which means that what we've been taught as children, that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, is actually wrong. It's a curve. Well, this also affects energy. So if you have space that's curved and you've got our sun and you see a star and you observe from Earth that star, anyway, you observe this, that star, you think it's there, but it actually is here because the energy is being curved. I think we have somebody else online here. So you're actually not seeing the star where it is. You think it's there, but it's actually there because the light itself is being curved by the curvature of space. Now, what does that mean? What effect does that have? Well, you remember the old thinking that if you walk around the Earth, you're going to fall off the edge. Now, obviously, we know better. And it's like walking around the outside of a basketball. There is no edge, okay? Well, in Einstein's view, the universe is like walking on the inside of a basketball. There is no edge. And so you would perceive no edge. If you went to one direction, you would come back the other direction and never perceive an edge. So when people ask sometimes, quite often, they'll say, well, what's outside the universe? That is actually a nonsensical question because it's like asking what happens when you fall off the edge of the Earth. There is no edge. We are basically trapped in the dimensions of space and time, okay? Now, this has some serious implications. Now, let's get into the no time. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to endure them. Well, time has been a delusion for some time. And when I first read about Einstein's special relativity, which is his relativity of space and time, that they're related, I thought, well, how in the world am I going to understand this? He's a pretty smart guy. I don't think I can understand it. Until I looked at how he conducted his mental experiment. And this is the interesting thing about the mind. Scientists use mind experiments before they actually go to the lab. So what did Einstein do? Well, he was in Switzerland and he was in a patent office and he looked at the clock on the town hall and it registered 11:34. Now, follow me here because it's actually rather simple, but you got to visualize how Einstein looked at it. And by the way, Einstein was that smart with math. He needed somebody else to help him with the math. He was an imagination. His imagination was what was gigantic. He decided that, well, the clock says 11:34. Why do I see that? Well, the sun shines a photon of light at the clock. Now, scientists don't know what light is. They sometimes treat it as a wave, sometimes a particle. But thinking of it as a particle, a photon, that is traveling at c, which is the speed of light, 186,000 miles per second. And that photon bounces off that clock and comes back to Einstein's eye at the speed of light, and it shows that the clock is 11:34. Here's what Einstein did that was brilliant. He said, let's pretend I can run backwards at the speed of light. What would happen? Well, he would continuously see that same photon. For him, time would stand still. His conclusion, special relativity, was that at the speed of light, time stands still. So now you've got light, you've got time and space interrelated. They're no longer static. Now, Einstein knew about electromagnetic energy, and it has a whole bunch of different wavelengths, from gamma to AM radio to radar. Well, there's only a slim portion of it is the visible. So the visible that he saw on the clock was actually only 1/10 trillionth of the total spectrum of magnetic energy. So even energy was limited, just like our view of the universe was limited to only 4% of visual, if this is even limited. So what did Einstein decide? He said, well, I think that we can come up with one equation for all the forces that we know about, and that would describe the universe. And he basically, at that time, only knew of two. He knew of gravity, which was space. I told you about the curvature, and he knew about electromagnetic energy, which was related to time. And so he visualized that there was a space-time continuum that was curved throughout the universe, and he developed an equation. Well, it so happens that that equation had both space and time as variables in it, and it could predict the present-day events very well. So they tuned the time back and decided, well, how does it predict the past? Well, it predicted that there was a beginning, basically from a singularity. The scientists call it a singularity. And he was so fascinated by the fact that, and so caught in his own paradigm, that the universe was static, that he threw a fudge factor into the equation to force it to show there was no beginning. And then Father Lemaitre, a Jesuit, and we never can get away from the intellects of Jesuits. They're always there, I want you to know. He convinced Einstein that he shouldn't put that fudge factor in, that there really was a beginning. And so the father of the Big Bang theory is actually Father Lemaitre. And he convinced Einstein that that singularity was at the beginning of the universe and that it exploded. And from that singularity and that equations of Einstein's, he predicted that the universe was 13.7 billion years old. Now, this is a bit of a misrepresentation. It shows the universe expanding in a cone, but really the universe is like a balloon exploding outward from the singularity. Now, why are we getting into all of this? Okay, well, there's something interesting that happened. It so happens that those forces at the beginning of the universe at the singularity were so well balanced that only in that balance could there be life. Basically, the four forces of nature, now there are four because after Einstein, two more were discovered, the strong and weak nuclear force, but I didn't want to get into that. The four forces of nature were so extremely fine-tuned at the Big Bang that the likelihood of the emergence of a single cell in the universe is like a tornado sweeping through a junkyard and assembling a Boeing 747 from the materials they are in. Incredibly unlikely, okay? Father Spitzer, who's a wonderful person, he put the probability at 1 in 10 to the 10th to the 123rd. Forget it. It's impossible. It's just crazy. If you had 1 in that number, that's only in that probability that you would get protons, atoms, and stars. And every atom in our body came from stars originally. So basically, the anthropic principle ties human mind to the creation. And the scientists believe that. What are the singularity properties? Well, there's no space because that singularity has no space. And there's no time because there's no light, it's collapsed. So there's no space or time in that singularity. It's totally ordered. Now, entropy is a measure of disorder in the universe. And the second law of thermodynamics says that entropy is always increasing. Well, at the singularity, it was perfectly ordered. Totally perfectly ordered. It was zero entropy. And it was totally unified, the four forces. So where do we go with no mind? Dharmas are boundless, I vow to be teachable. Well, let's talk about the brain magnitude and compare it to the universe. And we don't have to worry about all the details here, just to get a sense that they're both big. In terms of neurons, dendrites, we're not going to go into what those are, but you can see that there's a complexity to the universe that's similar to the complexity to the brain. But here's the interesting part. There's only 4% of the universe that's visible. There's only 5% of our brain that's conscious. There's another 95% that's unconscious, very similar to the universe. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? So neuroscientists made the same mistake that Einstein made. They thought the brain was static, just like Einstein thought the universe was static. Well, it's not static. One of the researchers is Dr. Newberg, who did brain scans of Franciscan nuns. He used MRI brain scans and showed that that their practice of centering prayer actually rewired their brain. So the practice of Zen or meditation of any type rewires the brain. And so no longer is the universe or the brain static. We know it can be changed. Now, matter and mind. How do we get from no space, no time to no mind? I want you to read this for a moment. I regard consciousness, this is a quote. I regard consciousness, mind, as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness, mind. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing postulates consciousness or mind. Now, if you heard this from somebody on the street, you would think they were kind of a loon. I mean, when you first hear this, most people would say, well, that kind of is a loony thing. Well, guess who said it? Max Planck, who won the Nobel Prize for quantum theory. Scientists are exploring consciousness now in mind, and that's the frontier of science throughout the world, I can assure you. And he was one of the first to talk about that. Mystical mind, here's another quote. The most beautiful emotion we can experience is the mystical. Now, many of you might know who said that. It was Einstein. I'm convinced Einstein had a mystical experience, but he never talked about it. And that's what motivated him. I'm convinced of it. What is this oneness? Well, the enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Well, what is this oneness enlightened way? Well, these are unknowable. I call this unknowable oneness, and these are principles that are accepted by science. Okay, so these are scientifically accepted, and it really shows the unknowable nature of what we think we know and we really don't. Okay. Evolutionary theory, 99% of DNA shared by all humans, but free will unexplainable. There's no evolutionary theory that can predict that. It's not part of evolutionary theory. Chaos theory, small events have huge unpredictable outcomes. That means that any evil we do or good we do can have a huge impact on the body of Christ or on the world, and we won't even know it. The uncertainty principle, comes from Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. It's a quantum concept, but nature is intrinsically not completely knowable. It's been designed such that we cannot know it completely. And I won't go into the details unless you want to ask questions. And that there are transcendent events are only available experimentally testing within the universe. In other words, if we think of transcendence as being, and I'm not going to say outside the universe because that's a misnomer, and even eternal life is a misnomer in a sense because that implies time forever. What I'm going to say is transcendent events are not constrained by space and time. They're not constrained by space and time. We can't experimentally test things that are not constrained by space and time because we are limited within the universe. We're constrained by those things. So how do we test for something not constrained by space and time? And you've heard of other universes and all that. Well, who knows? Well, the creator is really transcendent, and since he's not constrained by space or time or mind. I recently read the last published work of Stephen Hawking, which was published posthumously. And it was the first time I saw his rationale for not believing in God. I thought it was fascinating. Here's how it went. He said, at the singularity, there was no time. So God had no time to create the universe. That's like saying the inventor of the Volkswagen had to be inside the Volkswagen in order to build it. It's really kind of silly. That's my opinion, and whatever. So this concept of transcendent events, it has intrigued me and is intriguing scientists. Well, what are some transcendent events? There are only three that I'm aware of. One is near-death experience. And Dr. Moody described near-death attributes in 1975. And more recently, Bruce Grayson developed scale for attributes to measure those. And by the way, with a colleague, a neuroscientist colleague, we're studying that NDE with mystical experiences. We're comparing them. And mystical experiences were described by William James in his Varieties of Religious Experience in 1902. Singularity, where Einstein's theory developed the attributes of the singularity through his equations. Now, are these all transcendent events? I contend, yes, they are. Near-death experience have a paranormal out-of-body aspect to them. Mystical experiences we call them ecstasy. Now, very few people have these. I would say, in my experience, practitioners of contemplative prayer, Zen, Kabbalah, Sufism, whatever you want to call it, only about 5% will experience ecstasy, but it does. I'm talking about mystical experiences. The singularity has no material. It's dimensionless. It's very consistent with these other two. Cognitive timelessness, and those who practice the prayer, if they go deep, they know that they're It seems shorter than it really is. Well, the singularity has no time. There's no light. NDE, effective peace, wholeness and perfection, the mystical. These are terms that were used by Moody and James. It's perfectly ordered, zero entropy in the singularity. Okay. Transcendent events in the NDE, it's divine religious experiences people will have when they describe their NDE, near-death experience. There's a oneness with the universe. That's sometimes how it's described for a mystical experience. Well, there is unity. It's unified in the four forces, which we know. So we're talking about not being constrained by space, time, or mind. No space, no time, no mind. And this oneness that we experience is really interactive. Now, I have taught, I teach a form of contemplative prayer from a Trappist tradition. And centering prayer is what I teach. I don't teach Zen, I apologize, Roshi. So, but they're all similar, very similar. And I taught this to 10 people, and 3 of them, after their first sit, described reliving their near-death experience during that sit. That was profound. And so we're doing research on the brain scans of those people, and why shouldn't they be similar? Why shouldn't we all be outside, and I shouldn't say outside, why shouldn't we be in those transcendent areas? Okay. I actually finished in time, I think. And I do have a book that's soon to be published and should be the last quarter of this year, if you want to keep an eye out for it. But it actually describes my own personal journey into God's mystical love, which is also covers the science. So it's kind of a mixed genre. But I went through this process of learning to bring me back to my faith. And if you're interested in the more of my personal journey, it'll be in the book, and also more detail on the science. So I'm glad that we can have time for questions.
Yes, we do. Please, anyone like to or make a statement yourselves?